Hello, everybody. To end this week, I want to introduce a topic that we briefly touched on a couple of weeks ago when we first started talking about the Industrial Revolution, and that is the environmental consequences of industrialization. And we will also look at this as a response to industrialization, because what we'll see are, you know, an increase in air pollution and water pollution from this. And of course, people are going to respond to that. Most people don't want to breathe dirty air and have to deal with water that is completely polluted by factories and human waste. So uh, again, we'll end these last 2 days by thinking about not just the consequences, but the responses to this as well. How do you deal with these problems that are being created by industrialization? So, we can think of it in these terms, right? What are the effects of these economic strategies when you're turning to this new source of energy, coal, and you burn it to create steam, as we discussed? You have a lot of particulate matter that comes out of this. It's what I think Robert Marx in Origins of the Modern World referred to as biomass, right? So you have all this particulate matter that's coming out with the smoke as you burn the coal. So, we also want to think about these calls for change, right? And you've seen this objective before. We looked at it in terms of workers' rights, um, and we can apply it to the environmental effects of the Industrial Revolution as well. So let's start by looking at air pollution, and then we'll move on to looking at water pollution and how people have responded to these two problems that come out of this period. Okay? So Marx has an interesting image of this in his text as well. So I'll just include a couple more here and kind of expand on his uh, brief coverage of this in the book. So his images from England. I've got a couple from the U.S. and from England as well, and you can see it in the images, right? The blackened skies, the soot that's settling on everything. Um, not a pleasant place to be, right? And you have to remember there's a lot of urbanization happening at this point too, right? Where you have all these people moving to the cities to take these jobs in these factories. Well, this is their home as well, right? They live close to these places, so they are breathing in this air, this soot. It's constantly surrounding them, right? It's creating problems for these families who are rapidly filling up these urban areas. Right? So, we have to remember that this is not just a place of production, but it's also home for these people as well who live near these factories. Um, and in Robert Marx's Origins of the Modern World, he has an interesting quote. I'm not sure where he pulled it from, but he says, "The cloud of coal vapor may be observed from afar. The houses are blackened by it." Right? And we can actually see that in images from the 1950s in Manchester, England. That is coal soot on these buildings, right? That's what it is supposed to look like. I mean, it's really quite remarkable. And again, you imagine this is where you live, right? This is not just a place of production. I mean, these are businesses, churches, universities that are being covered by this soot in these urban areas. I mean, visually, it's pretty remarkable to see what is happening here. So, how are the people of London, Manchester, Cincinnati, these industrial cities that are popping up in the West, Pittsburgh, etc.? What is the response going to be, right? Well, in London, you see a organization forming, the Coal Smoke Abatement Society, set up in 1898, right, to try to um, deal with this problem that they see in their urban areas. Okay? This is actually still an environmental organization today. Okay? The name has changed. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it has continued. Okay? So it is one of the oldest environmental organizations in England. Okay? Um, the effect of that, of this kind of pressure that's being put on industry and the government to control pollutants coming out of these factories. In England, anyways, you get the 1926 Public Health Act, and then finally in 56, the Clean Air Act. And that's something I'm going to come back to in the future and talk about a little bit more when we get to the 20th century. Okay? Um, and you have popular pressure being put on local leaders, not just in the business community, but in the government as well, to do some kind of regulation on this. Okay? So you can see it in the political cartoons here. Now, something very fascinating about this is there is even an environmental response in nature where the peppered moth, through natural selection, becomes uh, a darker color. Okay? Meaning there were these two varieties. This one succeeds over this one because the trees themselves, the buildings, are becoming blackened, right? And if that's the case, the peppered moth itself, birds can see it much better. So through this kind of natural selection, we see the emergence of a what used to be a non-dominant form of this peppered moth becoming the dominant form of the peppered moth. Right? It's quite amazing to see the response of nature as well to the changes brought by industrialization. Right? Now, another thing to look at is water pollution. Okay? Now, this comes from uh, urbanization, right? You have the not just the factories there who are polluting the river systems by dumping chemicals and dyes and all of these different byproducts of industrialization into the river, but with the increase in population here, what do we do with human waste, right? This is pre sewer system. So typically, what happens is you just dump it in the river that goes through your city. So in London, that would be the Thames River. Okay? And in political cartoons, you can see how this is depicted, right? You literally have death crossing the Thames River here. A letter from the Times of London, 1848. We live in muck and filth. We ain't got no privies, no dust bins, no water supplies, and no drain or sewer in the whole place. If the cholera comes, Lord help us. And that will be a problem. We will see cholera epidemics springing up, especially between about 1832 and 1860. You have these kind of waves of cholera that come through London because you are not disposing of your waste. You're just dumping it in the river, you're dumping it in the alleys, etc. All of it eventually ends up in the Thames River, lowest spot. And you see it depicted in, again, in political cartoons as well. Right? Father Thames introducing his offspring to the fair city of London. Faraday giving his card to Father Thames, this disgusting creature emerging from the Thames River. Faraday was a scientist at the time, and some of his friends are trying to come up with solutions to this problem, right? How do we deal with this? Um, and the solution is sewer systems. Okay, so in London, you will see them setting up a sewer system basically parallel to the Thames River. So it's not going directly into the river. They can use river water to move it out, but you're not polluting the entire river. You see these images of construction. You can see where the sewer pipes will be. The river itself is here. Okay, so you're moving the contaminants out of the river itself, right? You're isolating them, just like we do today. And that is the one of the pumping stations for the sewer system in London. Very beautifully designed. Same thing happens in the US, famously in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. This will kind of tie back into what we were looking at earlier in the week when we were talking about Marx and socialism, right? Well, in Milwaukee, you have this movement that becomes known as sewer socialism because you have this group of elected leaders in Milwaukee who identify as socialists. They run on the Socialist Party platform. and they are focused very much on um, the responding to these problems of industrialization in their urban centers, right, through things like sanitation systems, that sewage, switching to city-owned water and power systems, which is basically what we have in Memphis today with MLGW, as well as setting up things like public school systems too. Okay. Um, Sewer socialism was kind of thrown at them as a kind of a derogatory term, but like happens to many movements, they kind of picked up this term and used it as a term of endearment. And Milwaukee at this time is kind of held up as a model city. They have clean water, they're not dumping sewage in their river, and they're actually recycling the human waste. For agricultural purposes. It's a pretty interesting system that, again, Robert Marx talks about this in the text. So, if you didn't catch that, go back and read that. He talks about the sewage system that they put in, which is not that different from what we're doing today. So, kind of interesting how socialism and public utilities like sewage, water, schools kind of come together in the late 1800s, early 1900s in places like Milwaukee, Wisconsin. This is Victor Berger. He's a very famous politician from Milwaukee. He was the first socialist ever elected to the U.S. Congress. Um, if I'm remembering correctly, he was actually denied his seat during World War One, however, because the Socialist Party was against our involvement in the war, the U.S. involvement, and they refused to seat him for a term, I believe. And he's eventually seated, however. But very interesting piece of history, U.S. history here. Kind of a cool political cartoon here. You've got Milwaukee socialism, the rising sun here, the kind of imagery that shows socialism triumphing over the city of Milwaukee, right? Creating this clean, wonderful place to live. And I want to end with this since we're talking about waste and poop and these kind of things. Okay? There is an interesting uh, connection to animal waste that's happening at the same time that I thought I could bring into. So during this same period of industrialization, you have population growth, right? It's really, really expanding during the industrial period, which means you need more food to feed people. Okay? Um, and one way of doing that is to keep the soil fertile, right? You can only grow so much food in one place before you wear out the soil. So you have to keep replenishing it with some kind of fertilizer in some fashion. Okay? And in the 19th century, that fertilizer becomes guano. Okay? These are typically found on islands off the coast of South America. Now, to give you a little, you know, walk this back a little bit, the Inca knew about this and used it extensively. They would take their boats out to these islands, harvest the guano, bring it back in, put it on their fields for agricultural use. Okay? And interestingly, these are some of the first what we would call like nature preserves. They had very strict rules on these things. The Inca did. You could not disturb or kill the birds themselves because that's the source of your guano, which provides food for you. Okay? You get the death penalty for doing so. Now, in the 19th century, as we industrialize, and we start harvesting the stuff on a mass scale for the global economy, we don't really have those same rules in place. These miners are very short-term thinking. The companies are short-term thinking. They'll remove the birds to get them out of the way so they can get to the guano. Um, these heaps of guano, which is what you see here, would be covered with birds. They're standing on top of it. They're creating these mounds of guano. This is bird poop. These are people. Right? I mean, this is a massive, massive amount. Okay. Um, and just briefly, the way this works, guano is a prime source of nitrogen. You have to have nitrogen for soil fertility. You get it from many different sources. Human waste is one of them. Okay? Animal waste is another. Bird waste is what we're talking about here. Okay? So again, you have this growing populations creating a demand for more nitrogen, and these guano islands become international supplies of fertilizer. Okay, you can see it in the advertisements here. And using steam ships, industrial technology to move these things globally. Okay. And here's what typically you'll see on these guano islands today. Right, birds like cormorants and other seabirds, right, depositing guano, right, which would be harvested. Another depiction of guano miners. Right? And what's quite interesting about this is primarily done by indentured Chinese miners. Okay, so what we have to remember is this is happening after slavery has ended. So you can't use enslaved labor to do this. So what we're going to see happen is we're going to see in the Western Hemisphere, especially, shift to indentured labor again, and that's something I'll come back to in the future and talk about a little bit more. Um, and you have a quite substantial migration of Chinese miners coming to work on these guano islands. And this is a really interesting image here. This is a bottle. These different layers are different colors of guano, different types of guano, created by an indentured miner. Right? And here's the migration route. Here's China, right? Australia's here, South America. So you've got this very heavy line connecting China to Peru, right? Primarily coming to either work on the Guano Islands or work in agricultural labor. And this is the same time period when you have migrations of Chinese laborers to the U.S. as well, right, to build the transcontinental railroad, for example. And that's something we'll talk about again in the future too. And if you look at the overall, key population of overseas Chinese migrants, Peru has a substantial number, right? 1.3 million. That's compared to other regions of the world, that's quite high. This is a pretty substantial proportion of the global Chinese diaspora, right? And not all of that is guano mining. Like I said, some of it's other kind of agricultural labor, and then later on, um, you know, more free migration, we would say. But nevertheless, the origins of it are in this late 1800s, early 1900s. So, just to close this out again, after Latin American independence, after the abolition of slavery, you have this shift to indentured labor, right? So you have these indentured migrant laborers from China who are going to Peru to mine silver. So if you remember, that's also where we've looked at these silver mines going back to the period of Spanish colonization, the Mita system, right? This is a kind of continuation of that, as well as the guano mining. Right? So to close out, again, thinking about these uh, environmental effects of industrialization and how people respond to this. Um, Again, just make sure you're thinking about things like air and water pollution, right? And then how people respond to these things, right? So typically you have advocacy, right? Civic advocacy, people coming together, forming some kind of organization to um, try to bring about change, lobbying the government, etc., like we see in Milwaukee, to bring about these changes. Right? All right, so that's it for today. Hope that was helpful to kind of clarify some of what Mark's looked at, and I'll talk to you soon.